Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. This episode is part of our Indies Introduced series, where we spotlight debut authors handpicked by booksellers from around the country. In each episode, a bookseller from the Indies Introduced panel will interview the author of a debut title featured in our program.
Hello, I'm Claire from Weller Bookworks in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I'm here to introduce James Robinson and his new book, Whale Eyes. James Robinson is an Emmy award-winning documentary filmmaker and video producer for New York Times Opinion. James speaks to audiences across the country from grade school to grade school about disability, filmmaking, and getting people to care. Whale Eyes is his first book and goes on sale March 18th. I loved this book. It's a great biography and it's a great conversation. And I love that it just brings people in immediately into your world. And you started this with a documentary film. How did you know you were going to adapt it into a book? And how does that process work?
Yeah, thanks so much for the kind words. This project becoming a book was honestly never something I envisioned. Whale Eyes started as a 12-minute film for the New York Times about my experiences with strabismus. So my eyes are really misaligned and I see out of one eye at a time. But immediately after that film published, I got comments from all over the world of people, many of whom shared my condition. And they were sharing really emotional and personal experiences. And it really felt like this wasn't about my eyes anymore. It was about us. There was this one woman who said, it's like having this little, it's like having someone scratch an itch you didn't know you had in the deepest part of your soul. And I was just really amazed by the response. And it just felt like it was this moment that we were sharing together. And so one of these comments came from an editor at Penguin, and he said, would you ever expand on this and turn it into a book? And honestly, at first, I was really hesitant because I struggled a lot with reading as a kid. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like a book was the perfect medium to explore this format that had long challenged me.
That's so cool. So how did you go about visualizing your experience reading with your illustrator?
Yeah, I think it began even before we brought on Brian, who's the really wonderful, extraordinary illustrator. From the onset, I knew that I didn't just want you to read about my difficulty with reading. I really wanted you to experience it. And my editor kept laughing because I'm a filmmaker. I come from the film world. And I kept calling the readers viewers. And I was like, well, I want the viewers to feel this. And he was like, okay, this is a book. But at the same time, it was also that was a reflection of what I wanted the book to be. It was an experience. It was I was going into this with my filmmaking brain. And so I was also aware of the fact that anytime you're replicating disability, that requires a ton of sensitivity. And it has to be done incredibly thoughtfully. And I tend to find that the best thing to replicate is not the literal experience with a disability, but the emotional experience. And so when you make your way through Whale Eyes, there's some pages where it looks like the words have exploded and you really have to pry each letter off the page. And it takes time and it's frustrating, but that experience and that emotional experience in that moment, the frustration, this feeling I just want to give up, those are all things that I felt when I was a kid. And it's funny because as we've been gearing up for the launch, I've had some of my family members and friends read this out loud and read these pages out loud. And there's this really funny role reversal where my parents will be reading it and really struggling through the pages. And I'm the one, they sound like what I sounded like as a kid. And I'm the one who's can we give that word, one more try? Or don't give up. You almost got it. And so it's this hilarious role reversal, but that's kind of what I'm going for because I want you to experience that frustration, especially for parents and teachers to remember what that really feels like.
Oh, wow. So how as you were choosing these moments, how did you kind of pick and choose what to, pull from your life to tell the kids about? Where did you get your anecdotes and stories?
Yeah. I knew from the beginning there was like one story I definitely wanted to tell. And if I'm being really honest, it was the only story I could think of at the beginning. But when I was in first grade, I really struggled with reading and I decided I was just going to give up. And I would just pretend to read. And I think like every kid dabbles with pretend reading a little bit, but like I was prolific. And so this career in pretend reading came to a very abrupt halt one day in first grade. I spent 20 minutes in our quiet reading period holding my book upside down. And this was announced to myself and to the entire class by a little bit of a tattletale who brought this to my attention, I could say. So for so much of my life, like that story was like a joke, and it was something I told to like get my friends to laugh. Like I used to hold the book upside down, and I went to write it, and like no matter how many times I wrote it and rewrote it, I was like, this just feels off. Like this is the story I've got, and it's like it's not. Just something felt wrong with it, and eventually I was like, why am I trying so hard to like punch this 6-year-old? Like, why am I turning myself into a punchline? And so what I really needed to do is like sit with that moment and be with it and think like, what did it feel like to rather like I would have rather just blurred my eyes and listened to the clock tick than try to get the meaning off the page. And what does that really feel like? And so I decided like I needed to have my readers experience that too. So I challenged them to like go into a public place and we hold our book upside down and you read through and flip through the pages and kind of experience that frustration. And so it's all about asking someone to kind of put themselves in that position and remember or just learn about the frustration of holding a book and to be grasping its edges and have no grasp of its meaning.
Oh, wow. And you bring everybody in to your point of view so wonderfully. And then you're able, in kind of the back half of the book, to kind of explore this feeling of getting people to communicate and connect and see points of view. And you use this notion of outrigue and getting enthusiastically curious to create understanding and connection. Can you talk a little bit more about that concept?
Yeah.
Came to be?
So much of this book was about like being the author of your own difference, especially in the second half. And that was something really I learned in college. I had this really kind of precious group of friends. And I don't write about them in detail. I really think like and I'll keep this kind of vague intentionally because I think they're the best authors of their own story. But there were 3 of them, and they were each the first in their family to learn how to read. And they had these extraordinary stories of how they came to the US and got full ride scholarships. And we had this just very unlikely friendship because we really like had nothing in common. And we were just so different. And so our friendship was this game of cultural ping pong where we would kind of poke holes in each other's cultural norms. And so we would be standing in a room and it would be like an empty room and they would be like right up next to me, like talking to me. And I would just get this feeling of like, why are we so close right now? But then they would like return the favor and they would like be like, can you explain the tooth fairy? Or, like one time they asked me, why does the Easter bunny lay eggs? And I was like, yeah, what's going on right there? Someone should look into that. So anyway, a lot of these questions and these moments of like cultural clashing brought out this very specific emotion that I felt like we didn't really have a word for. And so we just gave it a name and we started calling it outrigue. And so when you experience outrigue, you're like intrigued. You like want to know more. But instead of like leaning in, you're kind of pushing away. You're like, what is that? Give me some space, right? Yeah. And so this friendship and what these friends taught me is that like we don't have to tiptoe through this difference. We can like dance through it and we can be laughing and it can be an incredibly joyful process. And so I was a senior in college when I started making whale eyes, and it was right when I was embedded with this friend group. And to me, it like, I know to others, like naming your eyes whale eyes, it kind of seems like a silly thing to do, but within the context of that friend group, it was so natural and almost mild. But yeah, it kind of made sense, and it brought about this wonderful thing in my life. And so I don't write like a ton of detail about that friend group, but they're absolutely a part of like the soul of this book, which is all about finding like joyful and meaningful paths to connection.
Oh, I love it. I love just like the openness and the friendliness that you bring into your book.
Oh, thanks.
You're welcome. Uh, and I have one last question for you.
Yeah.
And I just want to know, what do you think it would be like to fly?
Yeah. I love that question. I've thought about this quite a bit throughout my life because my mom convinced us that she flew when she was a child. I think flying would be totally exhilarating. I think you would feel a lot of like contradictory emotions. You would feel like disbelief that you're flying, but also like belief. I mean, you really have to believe in yourself to be flying in the first place, too. I think you would be full of fear, and you would also be like, oh my gosh, like I'm doing it. But really, I think you'd be like totally absorbed in the present moment and just so focused on every little thing around you and how you're positioning yourself in relation to it, whether it's the wind or the weather or whatever is there. So I think it would be like the full range of emotions we experience in a lifetime, but just in a few kind of short moments.
Oh, wow. That sounds wonderful to imagine and to experience and feel. And
Totally.
that's incredible. Um, well, I thank you for taking your time for talking with us a little bit about your book, and it was great speaking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Bookstore Education Podcast, brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!